Pastor Jeff, here we are after a serious sermon, one that is very, I think, close to the heart for many of us. And you really talk about unfortunate events, and specifically, I feel like there's two different types of groups that will respond to unfortunate events, and I think you really tackle that on, if you want to explain a little bit more.
Yeah, well, the issue of pain and suffering and evil, that's the big question of the skeptic. A lot of people will claim, although I've never really met someone who actually, after you had a conversation with them about pain, suffering, and evil, after you have the deep conversation with them, that's not the real reason they say they don't believe in God. But it's a primary arena that people enter into when they don't want to believe in God.
Right.
So they'll say, you know what, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in God because look at all the pain and suffering and evil in the world. And typically, it's in the context of a child who suffers because that way they're approaching it from the standpoint of innocence.
Yeah.
You know. The fact is, we're all sinners, so we all deserve some type of punishment or some type of trial. We bring a lot of what happens into our lives ourselves. We make bad decisions. But the reason the skeptic will always mention the child is because of innocence. And so in that arena of people, I always like to remind them, you know, if you don't believe in God, what's your real problem with suffering? Because if there's no God, then we're just here by accident. And then atheistic evolution would be the theme of the day, which means that if you suffer, it's because you're weak and you have to be weeded out so that the gene pool can go from strength to strength and humanity can survive. So why are you having such a difficult time with people, especially children who suffer? It's just nature's way of wiping them out so the gene pool can survive. Of course, they don't like when I say that. In fact, I've had that conversation a few times and people thought I was coming at it as if I believed that and they got offended by it. I said, no, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm simply saying that in your worldview, there's no problem with suffering.
Right.
The only reason you have a problem with suffering is because you believe the Judeo-Christian worldview that life is sacred.
Yeah.
But life can't be sacred unless it's created. It can't be sacred if it's here by accident. If it's here by accident, there's no meaning, no purpose. There's definitely no ultimate value to anything, much less life. But because you do innately believe that God is real and He does exist, that's why you struggle with the suffering of children. Yeah. Because they are sacred, life is meaningful, and this child is being robbed of something that you think the child's entitled to. And that's the sacredness of life, meaning, purpose, and the enjoyable things of life. And I like to remind them, they're usually the same people who will say, you know, I can't believe in God because the world's so bad. Well, if the world's so bad, why do you want the child to stay? And so it just goes round and round. It's really a self-defeating question because as we've said before, the only way evil can exist is if there's a God to give us moral law, to give us categories that define evil and good. Otherwise, evil and good are subjective, and it's whatever you say, whatever I say, whatever somebody else says. Once you accuse God of categoric evil, you're assuming an absolute moral law that governs those categories. And you can only have that absolute if God exists. So the real question I've often said is not, or the statement that we can make that is a legitimate one, has more to do with this. How can we Christians claim God is good, merciful, and kind, and yet He sits by and watches all the pain and suffering in the world? That's a legitimate question. Because without God, there's no evil. But now, since there is evil and good in the world and moral law, then if we were God, we would stop a lot of the suffering, pain, and evil that happens in the world. That's a legitimate question. And of course, that is approached by twofold. Number one, we don't have all the information God has. We don't know how He's going to work everything out. But two, it's very clear that the reason you and I were made was for a love relationship with God. And once God determines that love is the highest value of the universe, He's got to give us the freedom to reject Him. You've heard me say, you can force a woman to do a lot of things, but you cannot force her to love you. Love has to be given for love to maintain its integrity. You have to give it freely. It cannot be forced. And so once God determines that this is the purpose for creation, He has to give us freedom. The problem is we can also use that freedom to open up the door to evil when we abuse each other rather than seek God. So that's part of the answer, but not the full answer, but at least it gets us started down the road of coming to the conclusion that if you're going to resolve or solve the dilemma of evil and God, you have to solve it within the context of God, not outside of it. And then evil is so intricate in detail that you're really not ever going to solve it because you're finite creatures, but you can resolve. How can I resolve to live in a world with a good and merciful and kind God and the presence of evil, pain, and suffering? And that's when you go to the resolutions.
Right.
That I'm going to determine I'm going to live my life this way, because I'll never know what God causes, what God allows, and how God is going to connect all the dots.
Yeah.
But I do need to resolve that I'm going to live this way. And then there's the final category. And it's the one we tried to deal with this weekend. When somebody goes through pain and suffering, and let's go back to the child. And I mentioned that if you lose a grandchild or a child to suicide or to cancer, to something, you know, we have this saying that no parent should outlive their child. And because there's no greater pain. I'm convinced there's no greater pain than watching your son or your daughter suffer and die. And so the question at that point becomes, how can I possibly survive it? And again, atheism gives no answer to that.
No.
Actually, the only religious system or philosophy that gives any coherent answer to that at all is Christianity. Because only in Christianity do you have a God who sends his son to be tempted in all ways like us, to experience suffering, pain, and death, and then defeats death through the resurrection to remind us that God has the final say in every painful situation. So you lose a child, is it painful? Absolutely. Right. And we should not give platitudes and resolutions to people who are in the middle of that. Right. But the thing that will strengthen them is us coming around them in silence and walking with them through the valley of the shadow of death, and then reminding them that God has the last word. And whatever you lose, when I lose a child, and Robin and I, not many people know this, but we lost our first child. So we were so excited. Robin was in her 3rd trimester. And I put my ear down to her navel every night to hear sounds. And we would play classical music, right? Because we heard if you play classical music, your kid will be smart. So we avoided the bluegrass from Tennessee, and we played the classical. And I remember just we had not named our child yet, but I would kid and name him Luigi. So I would say, Luigi's in there. And sometimes Luigi would kick me right in the head, through the belly or through the womb. And then she was driving home from, I think it was a youth meeting, and a big army vehicle they're present in Africa everywhere. So big army vehicle, probably with 50 guys in the back. They were drinking, and they came over and hit Robin head on. And the truck that she had, the Isuzu truck, was totally destroyed except for where she was seated. I'm serious. When we got the truck back, he must have hit her just on this side, because that was compressed all the way through the passenger side to the trunk. And the only thing left was a little space where she was. Unfortunately, the jolt was so aggressive that the seat belt crushed the baby. And I went down to the hospital, and it was a tough time.
I bet.
And at that point, I had a lot of people say things to me, but believe it or not, the thing that comforted me the most was Robin's best friend. Got on an airplane when she heard and flew, and stayed with Robin for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And for some reason, that was the greatest comfort. She didn't say much, just stayed with Robin, walked with us. And that way it gives the person time to grieve, but also to start thinking about the fact that, well, to tell you the truth, this friend gave my wife a copy of Jack Hayford's book. Might have heard of him. I'll Hold Him in Heaven. So Jack Hayford writes this whole book about how the God who made life the first time remakes it, and it's far more glorious. Robin read that, and I saw a distinctive change. We were in our 20s at this point. Maybe 30, 29 or 30. But I saw a distinctive change in her. And she still, we don't talk much about it anymore, but she still looks forward to the day when she meets Luigi. And she says, one day Delaney and Ciano meet their brother. The comfort that gives to a mom is beyond what we can imagine. I don't think as men we can really grapple with it, because we didn't bear, we didn't carry. I'm able to move on. It's amazing. I moved on pretty quickly, but it's not the same with the wife. And so I think that it is important that we are with each other through the deepest, darkest trials, and that we don't just try to do what Job's friends did and give some kind of spiritual lecture and then feel like we're inconvenienced by their pain and we don't want to talk to them. It's best just to be with them. And if they ask questions, to answer them and to pray with them and to walk with them on the journey. And anytime I've been through any major event in my life, that's exactly what has happened. The healing comes when you have friends walk with you through the journey. During my anxiety, my father-in-law was on the phone almost every day saying, God is shaping you. Now, when you got a mentor like that speaking words into you, then it's a little different. So it's why if you're a Christ follower and you don't invest in community, you are going to pay such a heavy price. Because tragedy comes to everybody.
Correct.
And when it comes, you're going to know, your ability to stand strong and weather the storms has a lot to do with the people you've surrounded yourself with.
In your sermon, and then even within that story, you really talk about, I forgot what you said, the Mesopotamian doctrine. Of righteousness and unrighteousness.
Prosperity. And that's still in the church today, by the
it's
way.
very,
Isn't
very
amazing?
much so, But even in thinking through that...
just for our listeners, prosperity. If you're prosperous, that's all right. If you're prosperous, you're righteous. And if you're unrighteous, bad things happen to you. That's a Mesopotamian doctrine that came out. It's a doctrine of righteousness. But not only does Jesus undo that with a guy in Mark 9,
correct,
a man born blind, but the Old Testament tries to undo that again and again and again.
I feel like, because it's within the churches, and even today, like, we have this bent that if we read the book of Job, or if we read the Bible as a whole, it's preventative for the unfortunate events. But it's not. No. And clearly with your story of a pastoral couple, people who were seeking Christ, like, an unfortunate event happened. And you guys knew it wasn't preventative, but rather it was staying with you guys. It was his presence in those moments.
That's a good point, Drew, actually. I mean, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. The story of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is that what God is able to do in unfortunate events. It's not a formula to make sure they don't happen.
Right, exactly.
That's a good point. That is the story of the Bible, culminating ultimately in the cross, which is the most unfortunate event that causes the greatest good.
Yeah, exactly. And I think of I think it's Alistair McGrath. He talked about the difference between The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, which was before his wife had died. And then he wrote A Grief Observed.
Alistair McGrath.
Yeah, and he talked about there's a major difference in his thinking when it comes to suffering.
That's a good point. Surprised by joy and surprise. And then, and then the other one, the entire book he wrote on the death of his wife and how he was dealing with it.
A Grief Observed, A
Grief Observed, thanks. Yeah, I met Alistair a few years ago in London.
Cool.
An amazing man.
Yeah, I bet.
Man, a few words, but every word matters. And we talked a little bit about the question of pain and suffering and evil in that context. And his wisdom on that's pretty amazing.
I bet.
But the thing that impressed me in our conversation was he can go through a list of people, and because he's an avid reader, as well as an avid writer, but he can go through a list of people and show you what they were like before they suffered and what they were like afterwards, and their view of God. So don't you find it amazing their view of God was strengthened, not weakened?
Yes.
Well, see, that makes no sense to somebody on the outside.
Right.
You'd think that the suffering would mean, what I thought about God wasn't real. But no, the opposite happened.
Exactly.
In fact, I go back to Philip Yancey's statement when he wrote, "Where is God when it hurts?" And it's the one that stands out to me most. There's a whole section where he says, the people who complain about God in the midst of pain and suffering and how God is cruel, mean, and just unkind are the people who have never suffered, who are on the outside looking in. And when I first heard that, I thought, okay, I got to read that again and again. And then you go through something, it's exactly right. There is a revelation of God that you will not have until you've suffered.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. And I feel like no matter the standpoint, everything's personal to you. So until something is very, like, you can be on the outside looking in and thinking, God is evil, God is all of these things, and that's still personal because you've had other personal interactions, but you haven't had a personal reaction with God. And not that God wants evilness to happen to you, but that's the reality of what life is. that things, unfortunate events, like you're saying, are going to come in, and it's not going to. Learning about God is not being preventative for those things.
Yeah.
But rather, it's knowing that He's in the long suffering with you.
Yeah, and that's the problem that we have right now in the Western culture, is that our idea of God is, if I serve Him, He's going to help me get all the things I want.
Correct. Yeah.
And it's so sad.
Yeah.
But what happened during COVID, I think, churches all over America will tell you that, in some cases 40%, and others 70% of the people didn't come back.
Yeah.
They're all new people now.
Right.
And you wonder if the people who did not return, other than going to other churches, I knew that happened too.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people. Drew, I meet them every day. I just met a woman this morning at Coffee Clutch Rancho. Hey, Pastor Jeff. She hasn't been for years.
Yeah.
And it happened during the beginning, so probably COVID, what was it, early 2020?
Early 2020.
So, I'm doing other things now.
Yeah.
So I think if your idea was that, and then COVID hit, and you realize how, God is not bound to make sure COVID doesn't happen.
Right.
And that's your idea of God. You may have walked away and said, well, what good is God?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't protect me if you can't protect our world from stuff like this, then I'm not in. And you wonder, the people who are coming now are people who say, you know what, life is fragile. I got no guarantees. I better look for something that's eternal.
Yeah.
So we're primed right now for revival, because what we're looking for is more pure.
Yeah.
And I'm like you. I don't think God is happy instead of something. I'm going to make you suffer. I don't think that's the way it goes.
Right.
I think that suffering happens because we're in a fallen world, and God intervenes and comes in.
Right.
I don't think God causes the death of a little child.
No.
I hate when we say that word. Well, why did God take this person? I'm not sure God took anybody.
Right.
I think what happens, you're living in a fallen world where sin and death are reality.
Yeah.
God hates it because it's an intruder,
Yeah.
but He comes in the meantime until the day He restores all things and works everything together and walks with you. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. So.
Yeah, exactly. And He wants to be known in those things. And He's more known in those things.
Absolutely.
Which I think goes to your other thing about Job's friends, of how they didn't get it at first, but then they got it the second time, of just being.
Yeah, and then, you just reminded me of something. Isn't it true that, doesn't God say to the three friends, I should smack you down, but because of Job, because of him, I'm going to spare you.
Yeah.
So Job became an advocate for his three friends.
Right.
I just thought of another sermon, but
that is interesting.
That is interesting that Job ends up being the stand between God and his three friends.
Right.
Because and you know what? That's what everybody needs. I need somebody that we have Jesus, the ultimate mediator, but. When you have a friend around you that walks you through this, and I've had my father-in-law walk me through most of my struggles.
Yeah, totally.
You need that person.
Oh, for sure. And the importance of, because we think when somebody goes through suffering, best case scenario is I leave them alone, or sometimes you think, no, you can't leave them alone or else they're going to be too enveloped. But that it's actually just being in their grievance, not saying anything.
Yeah.
And the ministry
of presence. Taking them for coffee and just be your friend.
And
get their mind off things.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a good point. So you're there, but you're not.
Exactly.
It's the in-between place.
Yes. And
like sometimes when my wife and I are talking, she says, I'm there, but I'm not. Something like that. Probably not exactly the same, though.
Yeah. That's a different context.
That's a different form of suffering that I deserve.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, just the importance of solitude with friends, or the solitude with God, and rather than isolation. You don't want people to be isolated, but you want them to learn in solitude and to be with God, to be in His presence. And sometimes it's just a simple friend.
It makes perfect sense, because when I go through when I go through deep dark periods, my personality wants to isolate. In other words, I don't like being around a lot of people.
Right.
But I don't like being alone.
Correct.
I just like a few people with me.
Yeah.
And I yearn for their company.
Right. Exactly. And how much more is that the perfect picture of Christ being with us, and what He did for us? So. It's a good one.
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to say to our listeners is that, this is a tough topic. This is a tough series. I want you to know that as a pastor, that we have a great love for you. And the older you get in a pastor, the more you realize propositional truths are okay, and it's great in conversation. But I've gotten much better over time, and it's only because of the pain of my own life of realizing that we need each other.
Yeah.
And that I really want to encourage you. You need people. You need the right people around you, which is, I believe, one of the reasons God established the church, the ecclesia. Not only did they come together in Acts 2 and 4 meet each other's physical needs, but we have to assume that they were encouraging and coaching each other. And then you have your Barnabases, where it just gives you that word of encouragement that you need. And it's not platitudes. I mean, and not everything they say is just brilliant, but just the fact that they're there and you're not facing this alone. That's what made Jesus' death on the cross and his death, impending death in the garden, so difficult, because he's the only being that had to face something totally alone, even apart from God. But he did that so that you and I would never have to be alone.
Right.
And God, in the presence of the Holy Spirit, will always be with us, but sometimes he does his best work with a few friends around us. And so I really want to encourage you, if you're not part of a group of people, you're not doing life with people, the price you'll pay will be heavy.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. That's good.